Let's take a walk through the park with Alyosha today as we break down books 5 through 7.
Ooh. You had me at book 5.
Welcome to the CodeX Cantina, where I am Una.
And I am Grand Inquisitor. Or something like that.
Oh, very nice. Well, then I'm Rebel Una, if that's the case. Welcome to the CodeX Cantina, where we like to take the most classic and respected books and break them down and have just a fun discussion about it. So if you Googled like books 5, 6, or 7, or the Grand Inquisitor and ended up here, welcome. If you would like, make sure you check out our Before You Read series that has a spoiler-free talk about things that will help enrich your experience going through this book. Now, let's walk around the park with Alyosha today, right?
Yeah, let's get to the bar. Get to the bar.
So book 5, in terms of summary, right, we have Alyosha and his baby boo talking about the letter, and she's like, yo, that letter was real. I got feelings for you, Alyosha. And Alyosha tries to kiss her, and she's like, whoa, Mr. Monk, come on, you got to save yourself, buddy, right? So he returns, and continuing our game of walking around with Alyosha, we return. He's like, hey, yo, Smerdyakovov, what's up? And Smerdyakovov is like, what's up? And he's like, where's Dmitri? And Smerdyakov's like, what, am I my brother's keeper?
Some sass.
Yeah, no kidding. A little Cain and Abel reference? Goodness, Smerdyakovov. Well, eventually, the real payoff, though, here, I don't think anyone remembers this of Book 5 because they just kind of want to get to the bar scenes with Rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor. Like, this is...
Guilty.
This is the highlight of the book for most people are these chapters right here.
Yeah, agreed. That was for me, at least.
So Ivan basically tells him about a whole bunch of terrible things, such as babies suffering, and says, how could God possibly, an all-benevolent, all-powerful God, allow these sort of things? And Alyosha kind of even admits that even he would think that someone deserves to die for causing that much evil in the world, which again, Alyosha, first the kiss, and now admitting someone should die? Come on, buddy, showing the cracks in the paint here.
Yeah, definitely you're seeing like a 180. You're like, wait, what? No, not my boy Alyosha. Definitely some strong changes there in his personality and character that you're probably not expecting.
Right. And then the Grand Inquisitor poem where basically he tells, we're going through all this doubt and we're going through this poem of basically Christ's second coming, a Christ-like figure coming back to Earth. And the Grand Inquisitor, a.k.a. a Pope-like figure, locks him up and says, people don't want choice. They want to follow me and they'll be comforted by that. And the Christ-like figure gives the Grand Inquisitor a kiss.
Yeah, we see that replicated in the story too.
When Alyosha leaves the bar, he gives Ivan a kiss, right?
Yeah.
The other part of the book 5 that nobody remembers is he returns home, talks with Fyodor. There's some talk with Smerdyakovov, and he agrees that he's going to be leaving for Moscow the next day when allegedly his father's about to be killed. Really? He's going to drop a man like that? That's some responsibility, right, Ivan?
He's such an interesting character. He's definitely self-serving sometimes and not other times. It's very complicated. I love how this character's written, and then I get very frustrated with Dostoevsky at other times.
Well, here we are at kind of arguably some of the highlight for this book, right? The book, we've talked about in our book 1 through 4 chat about a lot of the dominoes that are leading up to this. We made a case that a lot of what this book kind of rotates around is the problem of evil and even a little bit of the moral argument of if God does not exist, objective morals do not exist. Objective morals do exist, therefore God must exist is kind of the 101 basic way of phrasing the moral argument, right?
Yeah, and I kind of like looking at it from this very unique perspective of this negative evil look, because everybody always looks at it from more of a biblical standpoint of this positive and scripture angle, and Ivan here is kind of throwing it on its head while using that, but from looking at it from a different perspective. And this is definitely the pinnacle of the book for me.
Right. Well, we have all this doubt from Dostoevsky, I think, because we talked about how he had just lost his actual son in real life, and he kind of locked himself up to do this writing. And I think he is questioning, why would God allow my son to die? My son didn't have free will. My son was innocent. And that's where he injects, not himself, but he injects these doubts into Ivan, a very passionate, strong individual that's coming in and saying, look, in terms of if God says we must have this amount of suffering, which includes suffering babies, and basically what he's doing is he's pushing your face up against kind of what seems like senseless evil, right? In terms of the Turks with the baby, the little boy that got ripped apart by the dogs and stuff like that. We have our face as a reader smashed into what seems like senseless evil. And Ivan is making the argument of, if that's what it takes to get into heaven, I return my ticket, right? I don't think it's worth this amount of suffering for the greater good of eternal life, basically. I don't see the design in that, is one thing that he's saying.
Yeah, when I was reading this, I kind of thought about it as if Dostoevsky was sitting there writing it, typing it out, that he had, so in cartoon stuff, there's the little, red devil and then the little angel on the each side of the shoulder, right? And I kind of imagine that one of those was Alyosha and one was Ivan, and they're both kind of whispering as he's writing this story, both kind of giving their back and forth and perspective of it, of, well, this is why it's good, and you have to have faith, and then this is why it's bad, and this, why would God allow this suffering? And I really felt like Dostoevsky was struggling with his own, am I a proponent or an opponent of religion, because his faith is being questioned with the loss of his child, which I can only imagine.
I love that view, because I think it's so true how tortured he must have been at this time. And I think he also sees the country of Russia tortured as well. Well, I guess before we get to that, one last thing I want to say in terms of a way of positioning, Ivan's atheistic view, is he's viewing this whole time, you'll notice even in book 3, remember he had that talk about, well, religion, I think, does humanity good, right? Because if there was no religion, everything's fair game, and they'd come for your money, is what he told Fyodor in book 3. In here, he's talking about how people will give up, I think, their own free will, their own terror of stepping out into the world for comfort. And I think he's making an argument from a character perspective that that's what religion can provide for some people, is comfort.
No, I definitely agree. I think that what he's saying is that if you give up that free will, then you aren't responsible any longer for things that you commit wrong in your life. And then you can go to church and ask for forgiveness, and then you'll be okay and you'll still be admitted to heaven.
Well, arguably, I would even say, calling back to even the previous section, we have all these references to the Karamazovs being vipers, to being insects who aren't governed by a I don't know if I want to say a god morality or a universal morality. They have no morality, right? They're animals, like we talked about this in the previous section. And he's basically saying the only thing that gives us comfort in this is by putting on man's creation of God. He thinks man created God to give himself comfort in these situations. Like, I think, and the reason I make that distinction is because I think in your view, it's almost like this is assuming that Ivan has accepted theism as true, right? And if we if we assume that he does not accept theism as being true, then he would accept that this is just the lie or the facade that we put on ourselves.
Yeah, when you're reading through this, it's going to be a lot of, I think, your own personal beliefs, and that's going to dictate how you will interpret the Grand Inquisitor chapter, because if you don't subscribe to a philosophy or theism of some sort, specifically Catholicism or even, Orthodox Christianity, your viewpoint is going to be very, very different, and you might look at it from Ivan's angle instead of Alyosha's angle. And if you're questioning your own faith, you're going to be kind of, ping-ponging back and forth here. It's going to be very, very confusing, and you have to realize that I think that that's what he's going for here. That's one of the biggest questions in life, is why is there suffering?
Yeah. Well, and
we get no answer, right? I mean, that's ultimately at the end, is we get no answer, at least at the end of these chapters.
Well, and then arguably too, I think you started to bring up the Catholicism versus, orthodoxy, which is an interesting thing to bring up here too, because that's also quite the head spinner. Because if we accept that there is a God morality, a perfect morality out there, that this is the definition of what love is, these are our commands to follow it. Well, all of a sudden, how is it on earth we have different religions? How is there an orthodoxy and how is there a Catholicism? Why was there a 10-54 split? And why is there such debate over the palpal claims or the filioque, things of that nature? I couldn't help but bring those in at this point in time too, that I felt like Dostoevsky was clearly writing to both socialism and Catholicism in this part with the Grand Inquisitor.
Yeah, and I think that this is where Alyosha is trying to tell his brother, be like, look, you're right. And he's not necessarily questioning, and I know a lot of times we say that he's cracking or he's showing weakness or whatever, but I don't think he is. I think he's just acknowledging his brother and saying, yeah, you're right, but that's because man did that. If you take it from the belief of having faith, in an all-benevolent God, then you don't question those things because we don't know God's design from that perspective. And you may agree with that, you may disagree with that.
Right. The counter argument, like you said, is we aren't perfect, so we don't agree. That's why we have these different religions. There might be one scripture, one universal truth in a theism standpoint, but we aren't able to interpret that or understand his design perfectly is the counter argument, right?
Yeah, and to really to think of this in comics terms, right, is there's the multiverse, but there are certain truths in the multiverse that never change, right? There are certain mutants that are always, or certain characters that are always in the multiverse and never, ever change. It's kind of the same thing here where there is the scripture, the Bible, the word of God, and that never changes, but all the people's interpretations of it, that's what changes and ultimately messes things up.
Right. Now, one thing that I would say is a universal truth in this multiverse. Sorry, that was a bad joke. Negative points for
That's
that
funny.
joke, right?
That's good.
One of the things that I think most of us can agree on is that rebellion is a lot about doubt, right? To me, one of the main things to take away from in this head spinner of a chapter of the Grand Inquisitor is free will and choice. Because that's what the Grand Inquisitor, who I think is meant to be kind of a rip on the Papal claims, right? He's the new master who is heaven, who is not of heaven, is supposed to be imbued with powers, right? But he's still man, and he's still liable to make these mistakes that the rest of us are, but we're supposed to submit to them as master, is the orthodox, I think, criticism of the Papal claims, right?
Agreed.
And what the Grand Inquisitor is representing from a literature standpoint here, we have references in this section to the 3 questions in the wilderness, right? The temptations of Christ, where the devil tempted him 3 different times, and basically Jesus turned him down or didn't submit to it because he was basically proving, the concept of free will, of choice. It's one of the gifts that we have from mankind's perspective, and that's going to tie into Dostoevsky's rebuttal of doubt, is that sometimes you just have to have faith. You won't have these abilities to understand it with man's logic like Ivan's trying to do, and there just isn't going to be an answer.
Yeah. I also think that we could tie in here as well that this idea of when he is writing, and I know a lot of people bring up the point of that, that these Russian stories are so bleak and dreary, and, these are the questions for the ages, but you have to remember that Russia during this time is questioning its own faith as a society, as well as we see these grassroots movements of religion altering and changing the society and changing politics. He's taking all of that in as he's writing this story as well. So you have so much coming at Dostoevsky culturally, socially, religiously, personally, and he's just making this beautiful masterpiece, I think, in these 5, 6, and 7 books of Brothers Karamazov. It's actually very, very incredible that he's able to weave all of these stories and feelings together. And that's, I think, what we're seeing here through these parables of Scripture and Christ.
Because the people are kind of trying to make this choice about socialism and atheism as opposed to orthodoxy, right? And this is completely unscientific, but a small side note. Have you ever heard of this jobs to be done methodology before?
No, I haven't.
It's really interesting where the theory is people hire and fire things in their lives to make their lives better, right? I was thirsty, so I hire the job of soda or water or something like that to quench my thirst, right? Until you find something else that does the job better. Now, again, this is not scientific. It's just kind of one of those interesting theories that kind of has some truth in it, but we're not exactly sure how to define it, right? But there's one example where I think, if I remember correctly, they were comparing the purpose of church and CrossFit, exercise, as competing.
Okay, I guess you could compare any two things, oil and water.
Yeah, water into wine, right? But wait, that's chapter 7. That's book 7, right? But
we're not there yet.
One of the things that it talks about is that particularly when it came to parents and moms and people who had young children, they're looking for community. They were looking for a place to belong, to share values in, and sometimes if they couldn't fully receive some of that at the church. Oddly enough, CrossFit was a place where they could get those team classes, or they could, put their kid in like the daycares that a lot of the gyms have nowadays. But it found that people were in this methodology were firing Christ and hiring the barbell to fulfill the needs that they have in life. And that's what Russia, to your point, is going through, right? They're looking at, we're not happy, we're dissatisfied, we have a lower quality of living index compared to the rest of the world. We want to change, right? And who are they going to fire and who are they going to hire is kind of one of the decisions that they're going through in a very non-scientific way, right?
No, I mean, that totally makes sense that you're going to try to find comfort through that suffering. And it comes back to that again, is that, and we've seen that in many movies and stories, that we define ourselves through suffering. And that's kind of, I know, a very pessimistic, humanistic way of looking things. But who's that? Voltaire, I think, that we define ourselves through our suffering. And when you're going through the loss of a child, you're going to do that. And you're going to try to latch on to anything that makes you feel better. And if it's CrossFit, then more power to you, I think was what Dostoevsky through Ivan is saying.
It's an interesting chapter. And there's a lot of different ways to break that down. Like, maybe you had a completely different interpretation and you want to compare it to something else. Go with it. Like, this is not a channel where we get mad if you have a different interpretation and we don't.
You should have a different interpretation, right?
We all have different experiences and hire and fire things for different purposes, right?
Yeah, you and I just share very similar backgrounds in life and religion and philosophy and education and things we've read and passions. So we come with a lot of the same conclusions, but that doesn't mean that your discussion couldn't be very, very different if you're talking about the exact same chapter with your friends.
All right, let's get a little happy here and move into book 6 with Father Zosima dying. Wait, I went the wrong way.
I see what you did there.
Darn it, Russia. But no, we do have a lot of faith and positivity in this chapter. We get kind of his backstory about how Father Zosima was in the army. He had a hot-headed atheist brother. Maybe that's why he identifies with Alyosha a little bit, just saying. But, he took his aggression out on the serfs, and when a serf hit back, and along with this time with what was going on with his brother, is when I think he kind of had his awakening of what does forgiveness and love mean in his life. It's kind of his moment of truth that he's facing. And then one day, years ago, a mysterious man comes to visit him, and he admits that he had murdered someone, the mysterious man. He married a woman who didn't even return his feelings, and the serfs were blamed in his place. Sounds a little bit like Dostoevsky's life, interestingly enough. And the man was arrested and died before his trial. But basically, we read from his diaries and see all of his deeds throughout life.
Did you like book 6? I felt it was very jarring. As a first-time reader going through this, I felt like it kind of came out of left field for me. I enjoyed it, don't get me wrong, and I think it's crucial to the story, to understanding more about the brothers and their growth, especially Alyosha later in the story. But it kind of hits you from nowhere, right?
Yes, it's jarring in the sense that book 5 is a lot about doubt. And like we talked about earlier, book 6 is going to be about faith, right? Belief. And that was not apparent to me, because in the beginning, I'm like, okay, I feel like we're starting to besmirch Zosima's name, right? Because he's kind of like exalted as this holy one, and some of the things don't translate well that we'll get into here with book 7. But I'm like, is this Dostoevsky putting cracks in Zosima's paint? But I didn't realize that he's meant to be kind of the foil for the Grand Inquisitor, I felt like. So if the Grand Inquisitor is about imprisoning the innocent, right? Like, all these people, they'll believe in me, I'll give them comfort, but we know we're all going to die. Zosima was about forgiving the criminals, right? Which is more along the lines of what Jesus's life was, right? Like, he didn't hang out with the rich. He didn't hang out with the wealthy. He was hanging out with, the murderers, the people that needed him, the people that needed love. And that's what Zosima's life came to be, was this picture or a mirror of Jesus's life, of active love in a sense. And to your point, that was jarring, and I didn't figure that out probably until closer to the end of the chapter, I want to say.
Okay. Well, that makes me feel better that I wasn't the only one. And do you think it got better as you've read this several times now? Like, does it feel like it fits better, this narrative of kind of, directly speaking to us about needing this information for the journey of the brothers?
Honestly, the first time I read it was, 15 years ago, maybe 20. I don't remember it the best. I read it in a totally different state than I am now in terms of my religious path in life. But what I recalled, of course, was the Grand Inquisitor. I feel bad for any book next to the Grand Inquisitor because you kind of forget what happens in those books.
Yeah, but I feel like, too, is this one feels not as important as overall as its ideals of trying to talk about the main purpose of life. But for the book itself, 6 might be more important because this is the first time that Dostoevsky is really kind of directly talking to us. He's giving us this explanation for Alyosha's journey because he's sort of the hero of the story at this point in time, especially after you just read book 5. And as to your point, I think that sometimes book 6 doesn't get the, it doesn't get the notoriety that it deserves.
What you said was really interesting there, because I think you said something along the lines of Dostoevsky giving us like the answer or commands or something like that. There's so a very, very old argument comes from Platonic Pluto and his take on forms, where he basically said there probably is a perfect form of love, and all these other things of morality, but we don't know what it is. We just kind of have like these steps down into things in the same way that the best way I've heard it described is that when a mason's going to work on a piece of stone, he doesn't just carve it from scratch, right? First, he works out a wood interpretation, and then he looks at the wood thing, and then that's how he interprets into the stone thing. And it's that form that you're copying from into your life for how you want to behave. That's the argument for morals. There's a perfect moral out there, and we're trying to copy and replicate that into our lives, but he didn't think God had to give that to us. And that's part of, I think, a lot of theists' counter arguments to that of, okay, let's pretend that there is a universal morality. There's a perfect morality of this is always good, this is always bad, this is love, this is hate, evil, whatever you want to call it. The problem is if you don't, in their view, okay, the problem is if you don't have God saying you must follow this, or someone saying you must ascribe to this. In the case of laws, it's by being a citizen, you agree to follow these laws, right? By being in a religion, whether it be Christianity or following Islam, whatever your religion that you ascribe to, you're agreeing to follow these commandments in a sense. If there really was a universal morality out there that's always true, there's no duty to it is the counter argument until you ascribe to it. So that can't be correct is one of the arguments that's being made. What I like about what you said, too, is in this book, Dostoevsky is giving us, his commandments of this is what it means to have faith, this is what it means to love, and this is what it means to actively try to do good in life, even though this life is suffering and has evil in it.
Yeah. I also felt that maybe this was the passing of the torch to Alyosha. And we see this pairing throughout that they're each brother kind of has its own doppelganger, so to speak, inside of the story. And I feel like Zosima is Alyosha's, right? And that he is a version of him, and that Alyosha should aspire to be like him, that perfect ideal of morals that doesn't necessarily need to be grounded in a god. Or does he? And that's what he's questioning.
That's a good point because Alyosha admits in the previous book that if this person does all this evil, does he deserve to die? And he says, yes. And at the same point, when they're talking about the kissing, like we see some cracks, and I think it's in this section too, where he's offered sausage during Lent, which he can't have, and he accepts it. So we see that he is aspiring to be better in a sense too. Dostoevsky is creating that room for growth for Alyosha, that even though he is a very good character, we can still cheer for him when he becomes even better. Now, a small little tip that I want to give some readers, actually a kind of little fun tip, is I would say that you should be paying attention to when the word left and when, well, I guess the video slipped, when the word left and when the word right is used in this story. Did you notice that at all?
I wasn't heavily paying attention to it, no.
So we have some moments here with Liagavi. I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing that correctly.
You're not.
But he strokes his red, ugly, thin little beard with his left hand. Okay. So when the serf was blamed as the murderer for that mysterious visitor was Zosima in this section in chapter 2, he's innocent and his right hand is stained with blood.
Okay.
I'm going to point out that Dostoevsky, skip ahead 30 seconds if you don't want to know this little fun tip, is going to use the word left and right very interestingly in this novel to represent specific things, where left always means something and right always means something. So I just want to put out that fun little tip. It's not going to spoil anything, but I think it is a fun little thing to kind of follow along with, as he's going to lay it on pretty thick over the next few books.
Now, is he doing this stealing from other cultures? Because in a lot of different cultures, left and right hands mean certain things, or, if you're a thief, you get hand chopped off. In other cultures, you're not allowed to eat with your certain hand, or you have to eat with a specific hand. There's a lot of nuances he could be using here.
We'll have to ask Christy that in the next live stream, because she'll have read his biography and I have not.
Oh, man. Leaving me hanging. Okay, well, I like that.
So I'll explore it with you as we go through these next few books here.
Awesome.
But I just want to point that out for readers. It's a fun one. Now, book 7, summary, okay? Father Zosima's body is stinky.
Clean it
and
up.
they won't wash it. They won't wash it per the ritual. So Rakitin returns, and this is where we were just talking about how he offers sausage to Alyosha, and he accepts it. Oh my gosh, during Lent, how could you?
Terrible boy.
Right. So they go to Grushenka's house, and Grushenka's like all excited until she realizes that who she was waiting for, well, it wasn't Alyosha. We'll know that, right?
Yeah,
She's expecting a, quote, a certain golden message.
Yeah. She's a very interesting character, and I think that we see her, written kind of poorly maybe in certain aspects, but I love the triangle aspect of it, and I think that they all kind of get their due diligence of acting inappropriately.
And she tells us the parable of the onion, which is basically a woman dies, she had a pretty bad life, is told that in order to be redeemed, hey, what'd you do that was good? And she's like, well, I gave an onion to a beggar once. So she's given an opportunity to be saved from hell, basically, by being pulled up by by an angel through this onion. And she's getting pulled up, and then all of a sudden, all these other people start to hang on to her, and she starts kicking them off, and it's my onion, not yours, type of deal. And she doesn't get pulled out, basically, right? Which I think is, again, very open to interpretation. But Grushenka kind of says, yeah, I'm a stinky onion too, right? And says, I paid Rakitin to get you here. And she was getting all lovey-dovey, trying to seduce him, sitting on his lap. And good old Alexei, he at least for once doesn't succumb to the evils being presented to him now.
I think the onion scene is hilarious, by the way. Some good comedy gold in here as well, because we hadn't had any in a while. I mean, we went through a little bit of funniness, for the first few chapters, and then we got hit over the head with 5 and 6. Some deep philosophical, religious themes there, asking big questions of life, and then you get a little bit more comedy to kind of break this up. And I know a lot of people go through, the parables and the religious aspects of the onion and everything, and I think that that's a great way of looking at it. But I think you could just look at it that characters are complex, and that sometimes we think what we think is something that is very redeeming might not necessarily be so, and that other people that think something is disgusting or smells terrible like onion is delicious to them. So I think it's just something subtle that he's doing in there. And again, obviously the religious stuff is there because it's Dostoevsky, and this whole book is littered with that. But I think you don't have to sometimes you can take him literally sometimes as well as figuratively.
I wonder too, okay, so let's do the figurative route. You know how I am. Do you think, earlier in the book 1 through 4 chat, we talked about how Fyodor was trying to take on the sins of others, the holy fool, right?
Yep.
And it's the idea that he was almost trying to save others, kind of in a sense. And here this woman's being pulled out by the onion, and she has a choice. And what does she do? She tries to kick the other people off. No, this is my onion, right? So is this kind of also maybe even a subtle nod to you can't save others, you can only save yourself in a sense, and you have to have your own goodness. Your own goodness is what will be what does save you, is probably maybe a commentary there too.
Oh, but let's take it one step further, that you have to you give your shirt off your back, but then you have to give something further than that. You have to give, you have to give your skin, give your penance. That, she did this one good deed, but it doesn't stop there. You have to keep going. And if she had maybe tried to pull those other people up with her, would have that been it that allowed her to be set free?
Well, that's what happened in the movie Hercules, so that's what I'm going with.
The cartoon version?
Yes, sir.
Of course.
We kind of didn't get the last part of the wrap up there. We kind of just jumped straight into analysis, but Alyosha heads back to the monastery where the windows are open because we got a stinky Zosima.
You love him that he smells bad.
It was hysterical to me. And basically the end of the chapter is he has a dream, kind of wakens up. But let's jump into analysis since we're already there. And one thing I would say is I don't think some of this chapter holds up as well 150 years later. I know it's not totally fair, but let's just talk about reality of, I don't think modern sensibilities associate the death and how fast you decay or stink with the evils or the quality of life. Like, that's not something that has really held up, that it just feels strange to kind of read about.
Yeah, I think that might be a little bit symbology of the corruption of the body and the purity of spirit, and that he was a pure good man, and that his body is the thing that's being left behind and rotting, but his goodness has left, and all that's left is this tarnished husk. So maybe that's why he's hyper sensationalizing the stinkiness and the rotting, dying, horrible corpse.
Well, I think that's also a product of its time too, right? People really did believe that there was like a contagion element to sin, and people really did believe that your quality of life would impact how fast your body decayed. Like, that was actual belief at the time for some people. I don't fully understand, but this is what I've read, kind of doing a little bit of research onto it. But I think you and I very obviously know that we need to take this figuratively because we know scientifically what the fact is in that regard. But I think that kind of plays into kind of what you started to go into there, is that this chapter is a lot about sincerity. I feel like you had Zosima kind of call out earlier in the chapters when all the women were outside the monastery. He's like, look, you can say you love someone, but do you really mean it? Because you're lying, and I see through your lies. And I think here we see what happens when you do have those lies and you aren't being sincere and you aren't being honest. And I think this is kind of what this chapter is going to, is what does it mean to be honest about your sincerity?
Yeah, I mean, everything's falling apart, right? And he's eating the sausages and drinking. His mentor has died. Everything's kind of in chaos. And then I think it pulls it off at the end where Alyosha redeems himself and he finds his faith again. Obviously, I just think it's so overshadowed by book 5 and 6. So maybe we're not giving it a fair shake, because it does have, I think, some important merits and highlights.
Well, and you mentioned, okay, so it's the sincerity and rebirth kind of Alyosha. We also see that with Grushenka too, where she's admitting that she's a stinky onion and that there's bad parts to her, and she admits that what she did was wrong and how she was trying to seduce him. And we're going to see a lot more of Grushenka coming up in the next few books, right?
No, for sure. I mean, throughout this story, she's the kind of the gossip queen, and she's, flirtatious, and she's been giving off not a negative view, but definitely not a good Christian girl view, according to Alyosha. And we see her character evolving as well, as I kind of mentioned a few minutes ago.
So I don't mean to imply that book 7's bad or anything like that. I think I've enjoyed all these books, but just book 5 is just something else for literature, something else for philosophy, something else for my mind that I can't fully wrap my head around, honestly.
Yeah, I think we have, a lot coming. Obviously, we hit kind of the highlight of the book, but I think we kind of slide home here into 8 through 10. A lot more character development with the brothers coming up, and Grushenkov, and we're going to get closer to solving this overall arc of the murders. So that's exciting coming up here towards the end. So stick around, and let us know what you think down in the comments below.
Make sure you guys hit that subscribe button to join us. We'll be posting videos every Monday and Thursday. Una out.
Peace.